Well, hello, ALBW, wherever you are. I am delighted to be here with you today or later on YouTube, however you choose to watch this. In these fractious times with so much going on around us that affect us far more than just in our everyday lives, it's really important to remember that we have been in these situations before. And it's even more important to remember that there are people who became very active politically in order to make a point and move forward. Today, I have the great pleasure of talking to Jill Liddington. Now, most of you know Jill simply because of, that's big, simply because of Female Fortune and what became of that, which is, of course, Gentleman Jack. But Jill has been Jill has been very active in history and in feminist history and in action politically for quite a long time. So I wanted to take a chance today to getting us together and see what we get out of this conversation that might inspire you. And stick around at the end because we are going to talk about ALBW 26 briefly. Okay. So let us welcome Jill Liddington into the studio. Good morning, Jill.
Hi, Pat. Really nice to see you again.
And very nice to see you again. And I guess good afternoon to you, actually. But
yes.
So, Jill, you and I both know we need to get right to this because we've got a lot to cover. So I'd like to start way back in the beginning. What was it like for you in the 50s?
It wasn't very brilliant. It was kind of stultifying because there were very few options or opportunities for girls at the time. You're thinking, what are you going to do when you leave school? Well, secretarial work seemed to figure very largely. And then I wanted some adventure. So I wrote away for a leaflet about becoming an air hostess. And I thought, well, that would show me the world. It's got an exciting uniform. And I also wrote away for Women's Royal Army. Again, an interesting uniform and a chance to see the world. But in the end, that wasn't where I went because although I wasn't aware at the time, things were changing around 1963 when I was planning what I was going to do when I left school. There was opportunities. My cousin had gone to university. She'd gone to one of these new universities. It was Sussex. And I thought, well, my cousin's a year older than me. I thought, well, if she could go, maybe I could go. And the form mistress, the teacher in charge of our class, was handing out application forms to go to university. And of course, she was a Latin teacher and I was absolutely hopeless at Latin and failed it every single time. So she didn't give me a form. And I thought, they've been excluded. And I went up to her at the end after a few days of feeling moping and said, could I have an application form? And she said, well, I suppose so. I think I might have a spare. And she sort of reached for the back of her drawer or the waist of the basket and gave me an application form. And I filled it in and I put one of these new universities, which were just starting up. It was Keele. It was in North Staffordshire between Manchester and Birmingham. I put that at the top of my list. And I did slightly better in A-levels, the final exams, than I'd envisaged or they'd envisaged for me. And I got into Keele through clearing, which is the sort of scraping of the barrel in September. But I got in and it was absolutely wonderful.
Oh, wow. So what was it like when you were suddenly in front of this gigantic buffet of intellectual wonderment?
It was absolutely marvelous. It was one of the most wonderful experiences of my life, really, coming from quite a sort of straight-laced girls' school into being able to study these new subjects. So we learned about sociologists who hung around the street corners of Chicago, listening to the language of street gangs to pick up what they were saying. And we learned about these amazing German philosophers who thought theoretically about how we could change the world and make it a better place. And I thought all this is absolutely amazing, as it was. And all of us who went to Keele then in 1964, 68, so many of us have remained friends, and I'm still in touch with some of them by Zoom. So that's marvelous.
Oh, isn't that great? That's one of the things that's so amazing about the modern media, right? You can actually find people that you haven't seen for a billion years. So
Exactly.
what do you remember the most about that period, Jill?
About the 60s, well, I think probably what I most remember, apart from being at Kiel, is the 1970s,
Mm,
because with the 1970s, what you had, which you didn't have in the 1960s, was the
mhm.
beginning of the women's liberation movement. And I was always in the slightly the wrong place at the wrong time. I wasn't in London and I wasn't at Ruskin College, Oxford, etc., etc. So I picked up on these sort of ripples of excitement and innovation and revolutionary fervor rather slowly and eventually. But it was very exciting. And I think if one thing sticks out in my mind, um, it was Sheila Rowbottom's Hidden
Mm.
from History. And I think we've got here we are. It's 300 years of women's oppression and the fight against it. And Sheila is a very well-read historian. And I did have the chance to meet her when this book came out, which was lovely. And because she covers so much of women's, how they were oppressed over 3 centuries, it really is a very exciting read.
Oh, wonderful. And so from there, you, in having been inspired by Sheila Rowbottom's book, you started to look into some interesting areas. Most importantly, from the work that I've seen you do, is women's suffrage. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, it's for women. Well, I was living in London and sitting in a London flat watching television in 1974. This is spring 1974. And it was a BBC drama called Shoulder to Shoulder, which I think we're going to see any moment
Yeah.
there. There we are. There we are. How Women Fought for the Vote. This was the illustrated guide to the BBC series. And it was really rather amazing. It was how Mrs. Pankhurst formed the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, in 1903. Then it had a section on Annie Kenney, the Oldham Mill girl, and then went on to the hunger strikes of, say, Sylvia Pankhurst a little bit later. And it
Can you,
really was very, it just caught everybody's imagination, people like me of my generation watching it.
of
And
course,
that was
let me tell us a little bit about the Pankhursts, because you and I have had this discussion before. The U.S. Relationship to women's suffrage versus the UK's relationship to suffrage was a little bit different. So tell me who the Pankhursts were. What was where were they coming from in their fight?
well, the women's suffrage movement had existed since the 1860s, and
Right. Yeah.
the key figure was Mrs. Fawcett. But what Mrs. Pankhurst did, and she formed the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903, as I mentioned, in Manchester. But
Yes.
within a couple of years, her elder daughter, Christabel, plus Annie Kenney, who I've mentioned, a mill girl from Oldham,
Mm-hmm.
took action at the Manchester Free Trade Hall when the Liberals, who were just about to win the 1906 election, had this great big meeting. And Annie Kenney and Christabel Pankhurst, seats in the balcony, stood up and said, "When will the Liberal government give votes for women?" And they were hustled out and arrested and appeared in the magistrates' court the next day. So
Wow.
that was, here is Annie Kenney. She's a quite striking looking woman.
Yes.
And
Wow.
I was particularly interested in Annie Kenney because that autumn, Shoulder to Shoulder was spring 1974. That
Right.
autumn, by coincidence, I moved up north to the Manchester area, and I
Uh-huh.
looked at house prices in Manchester and I thought, oops, no, I better not. And then began to look at Oldham, and with my then partner, we bought a house for £5,000, which was had a little garden and was very, very nice. You can't buy anything now for £5,000. And
A
the
loaf of
address
bread.
was one Wood End Street, and I was living in Oldham, and I wanted to find out more about where Annie Kenney came from. I wanted to know which mill Annie Kenney had worked in. So I started looking. First of all, I read her biography, Memoirs of a Militant, which is not a brilliant book, but it does say that she worked in Atherton's Mill. So I got out all the local maps I could, Ordnance Survey maps, and started poring over them to find Atherton's Mill. Nothing at all whatsoever. So utterly dispirited, I traipsed into Oldham Local History Library and said to the brilliant local history librarians there, I can't find Annie Kenney's mill. Where is Atherton's Mill? Oh, they said, you don't want to look at Atherton's Mill. It changed its name to Wood End Mill years ago. And I suddenly found I was living in the house right next door to Annie Kenney's mill. And that was such an amazing discovery for me, that these women came from somewhere, that you could live next door to them, as it were. And this moment so inspired me. I went on to write an article for Spare Rib, which was a new feminist magazine that had just started up, called Who Was Annie Kenney? And what was quite nice was I was able to interview some of the older local women who remembered the Kenney family and Annie Kenney. And that set me, because oral history was just beginning to be taken seriously. And that set me on my direction of maybe I could become a feminist historian. Who knows?
Who knows, right? Wow, that's exciting. And what an odd, talk about kismet, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So what impact did Sheila, with all of that going on, and we're still on Sheila Rowbottom's at this point book, Hidden from History, what impact did that have on you and other women at that point?
I think the only word I can use is inspiring. It made us think that women really did have a history, and that it could be discovered and it could be researched, and we could write women back into history. And the badge.
There you go. That's got speech on it.
I'd moved house a million times since I picked up this badge, which must come from the 1970s, I'm sure. But somehow I haven't lost it. And I just think it conjures it up really very well. And what happened for me with this badge, to summarize it, was we formed a little women's history group in Manchester. I met a woman called Jill Norris, who'd lived in Manchester longer than me. And together with two other women, we formed a women's history group. So there were four of us. London was ahead of us, of course. There was a slightly bigger group. I remember meeting 6 women in a North London pub at the time. You know, everything was fairly small and fairly rudimentary. But working with Jill Norris, and the Women's History Group, along with all the other, there was a women in lit group that started in Manchester as well. And there was so much going on. It was very, very exciting. And we began to think, could we do some research on votes for women in the Manchester area?
Wonderful. Well, it certainly sounds like you had a very fertile piece of ground up there, given Annie Kenney and her activity. You mentioned earlier to me in our conversation that the Pankhurst version of history overshadowed the Votes for Women movement. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yes, the Pankhursts were very good publicists and had a lot to publicize, like standing up and challenging the incoming Liberal government. When will the Liberal government give votes for women, and risking imprisonment for that? But what it did was slightly overshadow the suffragist movement, which had a longer history and was led by somebody called Mrs. Fawcett. And what Jill Norris and I did was to go into the archives in Manchester Central Library, which is a wonderful, wonderful library, and climb up the stairs and go up to the archives and look at this organisation called the North of England Society for Women's Suffrage, and find out that they were taking a slightly different route and a non-militant route. They were suffragists in terms of trying to win votes for women. And from the Manchester Library, we then had the very good luck and very good fortune, and my goodness, luck can play a really big part in this, of being put in touch with 2 of the elderly daughters of the suffragists of Lancashire. And what we did in a tiny little car, and I'm surprised the car managed to do this, we set off from Manchester and we went up to Bury. Can you see it? And I'm sorry this is a handwritten map, but it is the 1970s. Everything's a bit rudimentary.
Yeah.
Up to Rawtenstall, up to Burnley, and then up to Nelson, where the daughter of Selina Cooper, who we were calling a radical suffragist, lived with her now elderly daughter, Mary Cooper. And we had with us a little tiny cassette recorder, and we parked our small car outside her house in Nelson and began to walk into Mary's house, who was incredibly welcoming. Mary was in her late 70s. And she was very welcoming, and we'd hardly got over the doorstep. Before she started on her stories about her mother, because she was absolutely devoted to her mother, and her mother was a charismatic character. And I remember, two stories that stick out in my memory from so long ago.
Yeah.
One is, and Mary was only 6 years old when her mother, Selina Cooper, became a paid organizer, a salaried organizer for Mrs. Fawcett's National Union of Suffrage Societies, i.e. the suffragists. And Mary really missed her mother when her mother went off to a by-election here, or a meeting down there, or a procession down in London. And Selina must have telegrammed Robert, her husband, that she was coming home on the such and such train. And Mary would sneak out past her husband and the housekeeper that Fawcett's National Union had employed to be there, snuck out past both of them, ran up to the station, and she was probably only 7 or 8, and went to give her mum a welcoming hug. And that story just stuck in my mind of how intrepid Mary was and how devoted to her mother, and what it meant for her mother to be just careering around the country, because there was by-elections and processions and everything. And the other thing that I remember was that, and this was again before we hardly got in to sit down, Mary said, and my mother was asked to go to a campaign for Votes for Women at a by-election in Keighley, which is just in the Yorkshire side of, over the Pennines from Nelson.
Yes.
And it includes the village of Haworth, which you'll have heard of. And Selina and another radical suffragist went up to campaign for Votes for Women at the by-election, and were told to go to Haworth. And Selina, who was a really good speaker, not a confident writer, but she was a really powerful speaker, stood at the village cross while anti-suffrage roughs threw rotten tomatoes and old eggs at both these two women. And went for extra supplies to throw. I mean, the antagonism towards, the bravery you had to be as a suffragist to speak in a northern village like Haworth. And Selina Cooper just said, you go and get whatever you want. You go and get whatever you want and throw it at me. But I can tell you, this village would never have been heard of if it wasn't for 3 women, the Bronte sisters.
There you go.
Well done.
Well done for sure. Wow, what great source information, straight from the daughters. Yeah, wow.
Yes.
Wow. Was that sort of feeling about the suffragists? Was that throughout England? Because you just said in the northern towns, were they more accepted in the southern part of England, or was it pretty dicey overall?
I think it was pretty dicey overall. There were suffragists and suffragettes through most of the UK and England. What was special about Lancashire and industrial Lancashire, from Manchester and Stockport, etc., upwards to Burnley and Nelson, was that women worked in the mills, in the cotton mills, and earned a fair wage for women, a fair wage. And the trade union movement was very strong. The number of women working in cotton mills, either as weavers or as winders, which was Selina Cooper. So they got an extra level of confidence, not to say income, wages, to be able to demand votes for women. And they did.
Right. Oh, I hadn't thought about that part. That makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense. That the labor
yeah,
movement
yeah,
there. Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. So yes, the suffragists and the suffragettes. We've talked a little bit about this over the 5 years that you and I have been talking. The suffragettes were the ones that were more kind of we're going to do this the right way. We're going to be a little quieter. We're going to look for change or work for change, but not necessarily actively demonstrate. Right? Or am I wrong about that?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. The suffragettes were prepared to break the law and therefore appear in court and, if necessary, go to prison.
Yes.
The suffragists were non-militant, and the
Okay.
suffragettes, as the campaign developed, and the Liberal government continually refused to give a single vote to a single woman. And the suffragettes ended up, as you probably know, with an arson campaign. First of all, setting light to pillar boxes and then to buildings. I mean, in fact, nobody was actually killed or even maimed, I think, but it was quite dangerous. And suffragists like Selina Cooper were very much non-militant. And luck comes into it so often, I find, that Jill Norris and I were burrowing away, doing our research, both in the archives and interviewing daughters of Ada Neil Chu, Doris Chu, and Selina Cooper's daughter, Mary. And we thought we could maybe make this into a book, but who are we? Well, we chanced our luck and we sent a book proposal to this new feminist publisher called Virago Press. At
Wonderful.
the time, it was incredibly small, sufficiently small, not even to have an office. So we sent our proposal in, feeling a bit nervous because who were we? Two adult education tutors from Manchester. But Virago
Well,
was so new. They were and so excited by this proposal. They said, "Come down and see us." So we bravely bought a train ticket and got our train down to London and went
wow.
to no office yet, but to Carmen Khalil's flat in Chelsea, which of course
Wow.
Chelsea was, I don't know what the equivalent of Chelsea, Greenwich Village maybe is the equivalent. And
Yes.
it was a lovely flat. And we discussed it all and they said, oh yes, we'd like to make an offer to you for a book. And so Jill and I went home and started writing very furiously.
Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. Don't skip the good part. What was that train? How excited were you about that?
Totally gobsmacked. Totally gobsmacked. Because one of the things about the women's liberation movement, women's lib as it got called, was that it gave women, some women, not all women, some lucky women, opportunities that they'd never had before, like writing a book for a feminist publisher in London.
Yeah.
So we were absolutely gobsmacked. I can't remember what we did on the train coming back, whether we had a glass of beer or something, but I don't know. It was just a wonderful moment. It really, really, really was.
Oh, I can just see you. Yeah, I know I would have been through the moon, so well done.
Yeah.
So
And
let's get
we set
that up.
Sorry?
So we'll talk. I'm asking Jen to put the cover of One Hand Tied behind us. There's the book itself.
Yeah. No course can be won between dinner and tea, and most of us who are married had to work with one hand tied behind us. And there is a picture of some weavers from Salford, which is just next door to Manchester. So with this in mind, but no cover quite yet, Jill and I set to work, and we produced what we thought was a quite credible book-length account of the radical suffragists in Manchester and industrial Lancashire, and sent it off, I think, in an envelope. None of this emailing stuff that was about to come about some decades later. Sent it off in an envelope down to our wonderful editor called Ursula Owen down at Virago. And she said, I think you better come down and see us. So once again, we bought our train tickets and went down to, and they had an office by now. This would be about 77, something like that. we went in to have this meeting with Ursula, and she said, in the nicest possible way, I'm ever so sorry, but this won't quite do. And we said, well, why not? And she said, well, it's going to make you look silly. I just always remember that. Okay, I don't want to look silly. And what she did, which was really helpful, besides telling us not to look silly, is she suggested that we divided our rather clumsy book into two halves. The background and information to the radical suffragists, where they came from, what they did. And then part two was the campaign, what they then went on to do in terms of campaigning for votes for women in a non-militant way.
That's perfect.
And we said, oh, okay, and came back on the train feeling slightly glum. I was feeling particularly glum because by that stage, Jill was pregnant, and she'd met her partner, Chris, and she was so pregnant that she couldn't get anywhere near her typewriter, which was feeling a bit tired, and couldn't get near her typewriter because she was so pregnant. So she kind of had to back out, and I just was left with this shapeless manuscript, and Ursula's voice ringing in my ears saying, you don't want to look silly, do you? And we're thinking, no. But I thought, I can't give up now. I've just got to pursue it. So I was just working 24/7, or at least 7 days a week, on getting it so that it would be acceptable to Ursula, and then sent it down. This would be about 1977, late 77, down to Ursula at Virago. And she said, great, fantastic. And I think at that stage, the cover began to appear. And jumping forward a little bit, not only was Ursula a fantastic editor, the perfect editor for this book, but Carmen Khalil, the late Dame Carmen Khalil, was a truly amazing publicist. So she sent review copies out hither and thither to contacts she had in the mainstream press and elsewhere, and it got reviewed very widely and with a lot of praise. You know, it sort of made your ears go slightly pink thinking about it. And what it meant was, because women's history, feminist history was beginning to be taught, maybe in adult education classes in the evenings rather than daytime. But it got onto students' reading lists because it quickly became a suffrage classic within a year or so. And it got onto students' reading lists and stayed there. And rather amazingly, it's still in print in about its third or fourth edition.
That's fantastic. So I have to ask you one question, only because I have been through this myself. When my first book was published, I went straight to Barnes and Noble to find it on the bookshelf. And I have to tell you, it was the most exciting moment of my life at that point.
Exactly.
I wanted to grab people in the aisles and say, you see,
look at this.
It's quite a feat, Jill, and congratulations on that. And especially because they're still using it. I just think that's spectacular. So tell me, what do you think?
What happened much later was a French edition came out in 2018, i.e. 40 years later, 40 years later on, a French edition came out because I got to know a historian at the Sorbonne in Paris called Professor Fabrice Ben-Simon, and he was just absolutely brilliant at promoting this with his students, etc., etc. So wonderful. He didn't call it One Hand Tied Behind Us. He called it The History of Radical Suffragists, which in French was much more plausible.
That makes sense. So what do you think resonated so deeply with readers and students about this particular book that keeps it in print?
I think because the Pankhurst story was really pretty well known from Shoulder to Shoulder onwards, and Sylvia Pankhurst's history, the suffragette movement, was republished by Virago, etc., etc., etc. And this told a slightly different story, not an opposing story, but a parallel alongside story of working class women who chose not to be militant, not to go to prison.
Right.
And one of the main informants, oral history informants, was of course Mary Cooper, Selina Cooper's daughter. And I've just gone back to check. I went to interview Mary Cooper as she increasingly grew elderly in her 80s, 11 times, because each time she came up with new stories, new memories.
Wow.
And at one point she said, "Oh, Jill, I've just been having a look at some boxes under our spare bed." She would be in her 80s by now. "And I've got all my mother's letters that she was sent. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Oh, yes, please." And there were letters from everybody, because, you know, it was from Mrs. Pankhurst when they were working together a bit at the early days.
Oh my God.
It was Keir Hardie, after whom our current Prime Minister is named, etc., etc. Ramsay MacDonald, then leader of the Labour Party, absolutely everybody. And so what I did, because I'm a bit unstoppable once I get feminist history research under my belt, I thought I have to write a biography of Selina Cooper, which I did, called Respectable Rebel. And there she is. She's, I think we've even got a larger...
Oh, yeah. Put up that larger picture of this book cover, will you?
Yeah.
There we go.
Oh, so there's Selina Cooper on our left.
With the hat and the white-colored dress?
Yes, that's right. She's wearing a pale dress and a rather wonderful hat. And then to her, or to our right, is Mary Cooper. I think she's aged 11 and not looking terribly happy about having to wear this big hat, and why have I got to stand here? And then on her right is Robert Cooper, who was a weaver, and he's holding up must be the Nelson Society banner. And then I'm afraid I can't identify the other suffragists, mainly from the Nelson Women's Suffrage Organisation branch. But I just can't quite identify them. But it's lovely to see Selina, her daughter, and her husband. And they met in Selina's house as a suffrage group.
Oh, that's wonderful. That really is. Wow. You know, that photograph, when I found that image yesterday, because I had, since you'd wanted to put it up, I tried to make the book cover bigger and it was just too foggy. Yeah. But if you look closely at that, that's an actual photograph. You can see how it's been creased. So I'd love to find out.
Yes. Yeah.
So we're going to get to and this is when Jill takes her feminist energy and moves it into the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp.
You've got it. You've got it. Yes. My life changed rather in 1980 because I'd been living in Rossendale, which is in industrial or post-industrial Lancashire, and then met my partner, Julian Harbour, who lived in Halifax, which is the other side of the Pennines. And crossing over the Pennines, as I eventually did with a luggage van for a couple of suitcases, etc., was a big change, moving from Lancashire to Yorkshire. And I went to live in Halifax with Julian. And I found Halifax was really quite a sort of traditional town. I'd lived in London, etc., Manchester, and I wasn't quite ready for such a traditional town. However, what happened by coincidence is when I arrived in autumn 1980, is things began to change, 80, 81. First of all, a women's liberation group, a women's lib group set up called Halifax Women's Action Group, and I didn't form it, but I was part of the original group and was still in touch in various ways because we all lived locally. And then the other thing which happened around 1980-81 was the peace movement suddenly burst out, partly because of a socialist historian called E.P. Thompson, who had lived in Halifax but moved away. He'd noticed in very small print the government was planning to introduce cruise missiles, nuclear missiles, into Britain from America. And the peace movement, it was called CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, went from that that size, which it had shrunk to since the 1950s and 60s, suddenly blossomed. And we had a anti-nuclear peace group in Halifax, and we met once a fortnight, and there were big meetings, and Julian was the secretary. And then we got to hear, this was a couple of years later, that a group of women from West Wales, West Wales, it was a rather obscure rural part of Britain, had started to walk via Cardiff to Greenham Common, which was a United States Air Force, USAF base in Berkshire at Greenham Common, very rural. And that some of the, I think 96 of the cruise missiles were going to be based there. And they walked, I think it was 120 miles to Greenham Common, which was quite something. And all a bit disorganized, but gradually it became clear that a lot of the women weren't going to leave. And they set up peace camps, yellow camp, green camp, red camp, etc., around the peripheral fence of Greenham. And we followed this with some interest. The birth of a women's peace camp, which we'd never really heard of before. And what happened, and this is my story rather than the bigger story, is Friday the 8th of July, 1983, 19 of us from Halifax Women for Peace set off in a coach at 3:30 a.m. in the morning. I have never got up so early in my life to be ready for a coach at 3:30. And we set off in the dark. And I imagined all these coach drivers getting out maps thinking, Greenham Common, where is this place, Greenham Common? Because they were having to take so many people, so many women down there. And it was pitch black to start with, of course. And we got towards Newbury, which is the main town near Greenham Common. And we suddenly saw this police convoy chaperoning the construction workers in their vans going to Greenham Common. And we'd done violent direct action training, and we just we had piled out of our coach. It was light by then. And we just sat down, cross-legged, crossed-armed, across the road and started singing because and what we hadn't realized, although we'd done some non-violent training, is that the police, of course, have done much longer professional training. So the police leading this convoy of construction workers to Greenham just deviated by a few yards away from our sitting down obstruction across the road and just carried on as if nothing had happened.
Wow.
And the police are very professional in this regard. Some police at the end of the convoy stayed behind, and those of us who remained seated across the road, which was half of us, which was 9 of us, were arrested. And people had to make an pretty instant decision. Will I lose my job? Do I have a full-time job if I get arrested? Do I have children back at home? If I do, I better not get arrested. In my case, I didn't have children and I had a part-time job, so I was slightly freer. So I remained seated and got arrested. And we were put into a police van made out of metal, and I have never been so constricted and so sort of claustrophobic. The sort of tears began to spring out of my eyes because the roof of this seat, we were in little compartments, each woman separately.
Wow.
And I could hear other women saying, "Don't worry, Jill, it's going to be all right."
Wow.
But if you haven't been so constricted and restricted by metal walls and ceiling, and you had a little seat to sit on, it's difficult to describe it. We were then we all pleaded guilty. We were kept. There were so many women being arrested that day that the police ran out of police station holding cells They just didn't have room. So they they improvised. And with us, they improvised at Newbury Racecourse. We were in the bar at Newbury Racecourse. I mean, there were no races and there were no horses, but it was just the sort of the absolute congruity of it. And it just, more than anything else, suggests how many women were getting arrested that day, because we weren't the only ones who were getting up at 3:30 in the pitch black to travel down to Greenham. And what we did is we had to appear at the magistrates' court in September. We all pleaded guilty. We were all found guilty, and we all had to pay a fine. And what we did, because as the suffragists have said, whatever you do, reach out to the public. Publicity is a key weapon. We got onto the back page of the Guardian newspaper when we were arrested, because nobody'd heard of this little northern town called Halifax, and suddenly 9 women were being arrested. Ooh, that's all news for the back page of the Guardian. And then once we were paying our fines, we got a great big cardboard tube that was about 6 foot high, and we put a little peak on it so it looked like a cruise missile. And we pasted our checks, if anybody can remember what checks look like. We pasted the checks onto the missile, and we had a photograph taken outside the magistrate's office. Yes, outside the magistrate's office in Halifax, and that got into the Halifax Courier, which at that stage really mattered quite a lot. So that was the end of my my arrest adventure. And what I learned from it is the key things is don't do it on your own. Do it as part of a group. Do it as part of a big group. Prepare and think about how you're going to reach out to the public who may not be so convinced as you with what you're trying to do, and that it's going to be a bit stressful. You're caring about yourself, but you're also caring about your other sisters who've been similarly arrested.
You bet. But the most important part of it is, and this is something I think about, and I'm not exaggerating. This is something I think about every morning when I wake up. How can I make a difference today?
Yeah.
You made a difference, Jill.
Yeah.
And brava to you. Well done.
Thank you. It was me and others. And I think we're just going to show, because I wrote about this, the history of this. It springs from the women's suffrage movement, because there was always a peace strand within the Votes for Women movement when the First World War broke out, and right through into the 1930s and onwards. So it flowed quite nicely. And if we can just look at that bottom photograph, I think we've got a I think the bigger.
There we go. Yep.
I think this photograph is absolutely amazing. This is slightly before. This is New Year's Day, the start of New Year's Day, 1983. So it's slightly before we were getting up at 3:30. But this is, you can count how many women it is. They're dancing at dawn on New Year's Day on one of the silos inside Greenham Common, and you can see what the barricades are like. There's razor wire, and if you don't know what razor wire is like, you don't want to. It's very, very sharp, wound round at the top of the barbed wire fence, with the police cars down below. And apparently these women, and there's perhaps a couple of dozen of them, it's difficult to say exactly, stayed up there holding hands, dancing round and singing on top of the silos to house the cruise missiles.
So Jill, because we have to move into the next section soon, because we're quickly gobbling up time, but why did women take the lead in this?
It was because women in West Wales, very keen to stop the missiles coming. One woman who, by complete coincidence, I was at school with, though she was a year below me, called Anne Pettit, had this bright idea. Let's just not go to meetings, more meetings and more meetings. Let's actually walk to Greenham Common from West Wales via Cardiff. And I don't think I'm sure she didn't had any idea of what she was starting. It was really quite incredible.
Good for her. I just want to make one real point here. One of the problems of having cruise missiles set at Greenham is that becomes a target. That becomes a target for enemies to shoot at because they know that cruise missiles are there. That's why because we have the same situation in southern Indiana, weirdly enough, that that's why it's so important. Nobody wants to have bombs, pointed at your town. So, well,
exactly.
Let us move into rediscovering lost voices. Jill, what do you say? After you continued to work on suffrage after you moved to Halifax.
I did. I mean, I found it very difficult to write the history of votes for women in Yorkshire. I thought I've done Lancashire in a couple of years with Jill Norris. This will surely in Yorkshire be very, very easy. That wasn't the case at all. And I got rather demoralised and left it and plunged into Anne Lister, of whom a little bit more later. And then time moved on, new century, 2002, and a couple of things happened. One of which was that the minute book of the Huddersfield WSPU suffragette branch, Mrs. Pankhurst's suffragettes, was discovered. And suddenly we could read, it had been deposited in the library, in the archives in Huddersfield. We could sit there and read a personal account. It was a bit like listening to an oral history interview of people like Dora Thewlis, who we may be able to see in a second. Dora Thewlis, Rebel Girls.
Oh, Rebel Girls. Yeah, there we go. Yes.
There's Dora Thewlis being arrested by the tallest policeman in the world. She was only 16 when she was being arrested, and she was called Baby Suffragette. And that photograph got onto the front page of the Daily Mirror, which was about as famous as you could get. And it was absolutely brilliant finding that minute book. And the other thing we did, or that happened in 2002, was the 1901 census, which is taken every 10 years, household census, became available. And we could look at these suffragists, who were often quite young at that point in 1901, and see what sort of lives they had. And do I have time to quote from one of them, or
you go? Yes,
I go. Right. I'm quoting from one of the most thank you. Light. This is from a local suffragette called Lavina Saltonstall, who grew up in Hebden Bridge and was a tailoress and then moved to Halifax. And after imprisonment, she then began to reflect on her life, of what it was like growing up in Hebden Bridge. And what she wrote was, if girls develop any craving for a different life or wider ideas, their mothers fear they're going to become socialists or suffragettes. A socialist being a person with lax views about other people's watches and purses, and a suffragette a person whose house is always untidy. And then she adds, life remains a journey, an adventure, and Lavina added, I only pass through this world once, and I don't intend to pass through as a bird flies through the air, leaving no track behind. And what was fantastic is that she not only appears in the 1901 census, I think she's aged 19, and she's working as a tailoress. We then have her writings as after she'd come back from long periods in prison. It was absolutely awful. 6 weeks was her longest sentence. And thought, I'm going to catch up on the education I've missed out on and start writing about some of my experiences, which she did. And yes, Lavina Saltonstall's thoughts and writings run through Rebel Girls.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. So then we also have, that was the life and times of a respectable rebel, which is Selena Cooper. And then we also have the other books that you were working on or did, Vanishing for the Vote.
Yes, that was the final book I did on Votes for Women. It was about the 1911 census. This came out in 2014.
Wow.
They said, we're going to evade the census because the Liberal government will not give women the vote. No vote, no census, they wrote across their census forms.
Wow.
And I don't think any women, any suffragettes did actually go in a balloon. I've been looking in the sky, but I just don't think it's really possible. But they did have some very adventurous kinds of evasions. One of the ones which always appeals to me, well, Emily Wilding Davison evaded in the House of Commons down in the crypt. But one of the ones that always appeals to me is a West Country suffragette who went onto Salisbury Common, which is a rather militarized zone, and evaded the census enumerator that way. And people like Selina Cooper, who was suffragist, didn't evade because they had to weigh up the options: defy the Liberal government or provide the Liberal government with the census data they needed to improve women's health, because Selina Cooper was somebody who had direct experience of infant mortality. Her first child, her son, died as a baby. And it was that kind of experience that the Liberal government, the best aspects of the Liberal government, Lloyd George's reforms, etc., that Selina Cooper, others like her, wanted to support.
That's wow. So we have to wrap up, and I'm sorry, because Jill, I'm not kidding. I could sit here and talk to you for another hour about it.
You're very nice, Pat.
No, I find it fascinating. I find it engaging, and most of all, I find it very inspiring. And for all of our audience out there who went crazy over the musical Suffs, this is the real thing. Yes. These are real people, although that takes place in America. We're talking about the English movement, but I highly recommend that you pick up some of Jill's books on this subject, because the fight is not over. It never will be over, ever. It's just really good to know what's come before, to be prepared about what will come later. So I very much recommend. Now, Jill, before we close, we're not going to go into Ann Lister, because we've talked about your work on Ann Lister many times. And most people watching today only know you for Ann Lister. So I'm really glad we had this time. But I want to know, what do you think your younger self back in the 50s would have said if she had known all of what's happened to you in your life?
Well, I just have one word for it: wow. Because we could not in the 1950s ever envisage anything like this. We couldn't envisage, I mean, it's not just the technical things like Zoom conversations and email, but we couldn't envisage all these enlarged and enriched opportunities for women, or that there would be a women's peace camp, or that women could write books, or that would be a feminist publisher set up like Virago, etc., etc. So I have one word, which is wow, with a couple of exclamation marks after it.
Well, I'm going to say it right back. Wow. What a life. Well done, you.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, you still have that badge, don't you?
Yes. I'm just going to put it on. I don't know whether anyone can see.
There it is. Yep.
Yep, there it is. Yep.
Well done. Jill Liddington, I want to thank you for our time together, and I want to thank you for all the work that you've done, and I want to thank you for the impact that you've had on history in general and women's history in particular.
Well, thank you, Pat, and thank you for a lovely interview. Thank you.
Indeed. So we're going to wait. Well, we have people in the audience, but we haven't seen any questions pop up. To those people in the audience, if you have a question, do it quick, because we have to move on and talk a little bit about ALBW. Nope, we're just getting thank yous at this point. So you are very fine on this.
Well,
Jill,
I'd like to thank Rachel Lappin, who's been sitting by my side, and if things haven't gone wrong technically, it's because Rachel has been holding my hand, as it were, throughout this. So thank you, Rachel.
She does it so well. And, let's close with this. I want to close with this. I remember when you came on your book tour in the United States, and I remember you coming to our house, and I remember the hassle our driver had in finding you at the train station.
Oh, yes.
But I am so glad that he did, and it has been a marvelous almost 6 years now of knowing you, Jill. And I hope we stay friends for a whole lot longer. So be
we
well.
will do. We definitely will do, Pat. Thank you very much. Thank you, ALBW.
Thank
and
you.
Rachel.
Thank you. So stay around, everybody else, because we're going to talk briefly about, yes, indeed, ALBW 26. Jen, you want to put that poster up there? Okay. It is our 5th anniversary. Who could have even imagined? So April 2 through 5. Our first actual event will be on Friday, April 3rd, at which point we will have our birthday bash, which is great because number one, it's on a Friday. And number two, because the school holidays work out for the UK this year. So we're very excited about this. And of course, the Ann-Lister Society will also be meeting at that time. So we have ALBW and the Ann-Lister Society. We don't know whether or not there will be another ALF. They'll let us know in July after they've had a chance to sort of break down what happened this year and if it's worth their while and all the rest of the things that have to go into planning an event. But there is an ALBW. And I do hope that you'll come because Cheryl and I have a few special things in the works to celebrate the fact that it is our 5th anniversary and to celebrate the fact that she and I have been doing this now for almost 7 years because we didn't get to throw the first 2. And I just really hope all of you out there who have been thinking about coming back to ALBW, or all of you out there who have been thinking one of these days I'll get there, this is the year. 26 is the year. Get there. No one ever knows what the future brings. So I hope for all of you who are listening now, remember what it feels like to be in Halifax with our community, surrounded by so many other women whose lives are so similar to yours, in a space that is so welcoming and so wonderful. So please put it on your calendar because by God, I am sure looking forward to seeing you there. Okay? All right. So thank you so much. And I will see you in Halifax.